want to say how grateful I am for the invitation to participate in tonight's debate. I've really been looking forward to discussing the issues with Dr. Ehrman this evening. In preparing for this debate, I had quite a surprise. I was amazed to discover how much our life stories are alike. As slightly marginalized teenage boys with some passing acquaintance with Christianity, both of our lives were turned upside down when at the age of 15 or 16, we each experienced a spiritual rebirth through personal faith in Christ. Eager to serve Him, we both attended the same college in Illinois, Wheaton College, where we both even studied Greek under the same professor. After graduation, we both went on to pursue doctoral studies. Thereafter, our paths radically diverged. I received a fellowship from the German government to study the resurrection of Jesus under the direction of Wolfhard Pannenberg and Ferdinand Hahn at the University of Munich and at Cambridge University. As a result of my studies, I became even more convinced of the historical credibility of that event. Of course, ever since my conversion, I had believed in the resurrection of Jesus on the basis of my personal experience. And I still think that this experiential approach to the resurrection is a perfectly valid way to knowing that Christ is risen. It's the way that most Christians today know that Jesus is risen and alive. But as a result of my studies, I came to see that a remarkably good case can be made for Jesus' resurrection historically as well. And I hope to show tonight that the resurrection of Jesus is the best explanation of certain well-established facts about Jesus. Sadly, Dr. Ehrman came to radically different conclusions as a result of his studies. In his most recent book, he poignantly describes how he came to lose his teenage faith. I'm not sure, based on Dr. Ehrman's writings, whether he still believes in Jesus' resurrection or not. He never denies it, but he does deny that there can be historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection. He maintains that there cannot be historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection. Now, this is a very bold claim, and so naturally I was interested to see what argument he would offer for its justification. I was stunned to discover that the philosophical argument he gives for this claim is an old argument against the identification of miracles, which I had studied during my doctoral research, and which is regarded by most philosophers today as demonstrably fallacious. Now, so as not to steal Dr. Ehrman's thunder, I'll wait until he's presented his arguments before I show where the fallacy lies. For now, I want to briefly sketch how a historical case for Jesus' resurrection might look. In constructing a case for Jesus' resurrection, it's important to distinguish between the evidence and the best explanation of that evidence. This distinction is important because in this case, the evidence is relatively uncontroversial. As we'll see, it's agreed to by most scholars. On the other hand, the explanation of that evidence is controversial. That the resurrection is the best explanation is a matter of controversy. Now, although Dr. Ehrman says that there cannot be any historical evidence for the resurrection, what we'll see is that he really means that there cannot be, or that the resurrection cannot be, the best explanation of that evidence, not that there is no evidence. That leads me then to my first major contention, namely, there are four historical facts which must be explained by any adequate historical hypothesis. Jesus' burial, the discovery of his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. Now let's look at that first contention more closely. I want to share four facts which are widely accepted by historians today. Fact number one. After his crucifixion, Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. Historians have established this fact on the basis of evidence such as the following. 1. Jesus' burial is multiply attested in early independent sources. We have four biographies of Jesus by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which have been collected into the New Testament, along with various letters of the Apostle Paul. Now, the burial account is part of Mark's source material for the story of Jesus' suffering and death. This is a very early source, which is probably based on eyewitness testimony, and which the commentator Rudolf Pesch dates to within 7 years of the crucifixion. Moreover, Paul also cites an extremely early source for Jesus' burial, which most scholars date to within 5 years of Jesus' crucifixion. Independent testimony to Jesus' burial by Joseph is also found in the sources behind Matthew and Luke and the Gospel of John, not to mention the extra-biblical Gospel of Peter. Thus we have the remarkable number of at least 5 independent sources for Jesus' burial, some of which are extraordinarily early. 2. As a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin that condemned Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea is unlikely to be a Christian invention. There was an understandable hostility in the early church toward the Jewish leaders. In Christian eyes, they had engineered a judicial murder of Jesus. Thus, according to the late New Testament scholar Raymond Brown, Jesus' burial by Joseph is very probable, since it is almost inexplicable why Christians would make up a story about a Jewish Sanhedrist who does what is right by Jesus. For these and other reasons, most New Testament critics concur that Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. According to the late John A.T. Robinson of Cambridge University, the burial of Jesus in the tomb is one of the earliest and best attested facts about Jesus. Fact number 2. On the Sunday after the crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. Among the reasons which have led most scholars to this conclusion are the following. 1. The empty tomb is also multiply attested by independent early sources. Mark's source didn't end with the burial, but with the story of the empty tomb, which is tied to the burial story verbally and grammatically. Moreover, Matthew and John have independent sources about the empty tomb. It's also mentioned in the sermons in the Acts of the Apostles, and it's implied by Paul in his first letter to the Corinthian church. Thus we have again multiple, early, independent attestation of the fact of the empty tomb. 2. The tomb was discovered empty by women. In patriarchal Jewish society, the testimony of women was not highly regarded. In fact, the Jewish historian Josephus says that women weren't even permitted to serve as witnesses in a Jewish court of law. Now, in light of this fact, how remarkable it is that it is women who are the discoverers of Jesus' empty tomb. Any later legendary account would certainly have made male disciples like Peter and John discover the empty tomb. The fact that it is women rather than men who are the discoverers of the empty tomb is best explained by the fact that they were the chief witnesses to the fact of the empty tomb. And the gospel writers faithfully record what, for them, was an awkward and embarrassing fact. I could go on, but I think enough has been said to indicate why, in the words of Jakob Kramer, an Austrian specialist on the resurrection, by far most exegetes hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements concerning the empty tomb. Fact number 3. On different occasions and under various circumstances, different individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive from the dead. This is a fact which is virtually universally acknowledged by scholars for the following reasons. 1. Paul's list of eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection appearances guarantees that such appearances occurred. Paul tells us that Jesus appeared to his chief disciple, Peter, then to the inner circle of disciples known as the 12. Then he appeared to a group of 500 disciples at once. Then to his younger brother James, who up to that time was apparently not a believer. Then to all the apostles. Finally, Paul adds, he appeared also to me, at the time when Paul was still a persecutor of the early Jesus movement. Given the early date of Paul's information, as well as his personal acquaintance with the people involved, these appearances cannot be dismissed as mere legends. Second, the appearance narratives in the Gospels provide multiple independent attestation of the appearances. For example, the appearance to Peter is attested by Luke and Paul. The appearance to the 12 is attested by Luke, John, and Paul. And the appearance to the women is attested by Matthew and John. The appearance narrative spans such a breadth of independent sources that it cannot be reasonably denied that the earliest disciples did have such experiences. Thus even the skeptical German New Testament critic Gerhard Ludemann concludes, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Finally, fact number 4, the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead despite their having every predisposition to the contrary. Think of the situation the disciples faced following Jesus' crucifixion. Number 1, their leader was dead. And Jewish messianic expectations had no idea of a Messiah who, instead of triumphing over Israel's enemies, would be shamefully executed by them as a criminal. 2, Jewish beliefs about the afterlife precluded anyone's rising from the dead to glory and immortality before the general resurrection of the dead at the end of the world. Nevertheless, the original disciples suddenly came to believe so strongly that God had raised Jesus from the dead that they were willing to die for the truth of that belief. But then the obvious question arises. What in the world caused them to believe such an un-Jewish and outlandish thing? Luke Johnson, a New Testament scholar at Emory University, muses, some sort of powerful, transformative experiences required to generate the sort of movement earliest Christianity was. And N.T. Wright, an eminent British scholar, concludes, that is why, as an historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him. In summary, there are 4 facts agreed upon by the majority of scholars: Jesus' burial, the discovery of his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. Now, in his early published work, Dr. Ehrman expressed skepticism about these facts. He insisted that we cannot really affirm these facts. Why not? Well, he gave 2 reasons. First, he said, historians cannot say that a miracle probably occurred. But here he was obviously confusing the evidence for the resurrection with the best explanation of the evidence. The resurrection of Jesus is a miraculous explanation of the evidence. But the evidence itself is not miraculous. None of these 4 facts is in any way supernatural or inaccessible to the historian. To give an analogy, did you know that after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, there was actually a plot to steal his body as it was being transported by train back to Illinois? Now, the historian will obviously want to know whether this plot was foiled or not. Was Lincoln's body missing from the train? Was it successfully interred in the tomb in Springfield? Did his closest associates, like Secretary of War Stanton or Vice President Johnson, claim to have seen appearances of Lincoln alive after his death, and so on? These are questions any historian can investigate, and it's the same with the 4 facts about Jesus. But Professor Ehrman had a second reason why he thought the historian cannot affirm these facts. The gospel accounts of these events are hopelessly contradictory. But the problem with this line of argument is that it assumes 3 things. 1, that the inconsistencies are irresolvable rather than merely apparent. 2, that the inconsistencies lie at the heart of the narrative rather than just in the secondary peripheral details. And 3, that all of the accounts have an equal claim to historical reliability, since the presence of inconsistencies in a later, less reliable source does nothing to undermine the credibility of an earlier, more credible source. In fact, when you look at the supposed inconsistencies, what you find is that most of them, like the names and number of the women who visited the tomb, are merely apparent, not real. Moreover, the alleged consistencies are found in the secondary circumstantial details of the story and have no effect at all on the four facts as I've stated them. So most historians haven't been deterred by these sorts of objections. And in fact, Dr. Ehrman has himself come to rethink his position on these issues. Inconsistencies in the details notwithstanding, he now recognizes that we have solid traditions, not only for Jesus' burial, but also for the women's discovery of the empty tomb. And therefore, he says, we can conclude with some certainty that Jesus was in fact buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb, and that 3 days later, the tomb was found empty. When I discovered that Professor Ehrman had reversed himself on this question, my admiration for his honesty and scholarly objectivity shot up. Very few scholars, once they've gone into print on an issue, have the courage to rethink that issue and admit that they were wrong. Dr. Ehrman's reversal of his opinion on these matters is testimony not merely to the force of the evidence for these four facts, but also to his determination to follow the evidence wherever it leads. What this means is that my first contention is not an issue of disagreement in tonight's debate. The whole debate will therefore turn upon Dr. Ehrman's response to my second contention, namely that the best explanation of these facts is that Jesus rose from the dead. This, of course, was the explanation that the eyewitnesses themselves gave, and I can think of no better explanation. The resurrection hypothesis passes all of the standard criteria for being the best explanation, such as explanatory power, explanatory scope, plausibility, and so forth. Of course, down through history, various alternative naturalistic explanations of the resurrection have been proposed, such as the conspiracy hypothesis, the apparent death hypothesis, the hallucination hypothesis, and so on. In the judgment of contemporary scholarship, however, none of these naturalistic hypotheses has managed to provide a plausible explanation of the facts. Nor does Dr. Ehrman support any of these naturalistic explanations of the facts. So why, we may ask, does Dr. Ehrman not accept the resurrection as the best explanation? The answer is simple. The resurrection is a miracle. And Dr. Ehrman denies the possibility of establishing a miracle. He writes, because historians can only establish what probably happened, and a miracle of this nature is highly improbable, the historian cannot say it probably occurred. This argument against the identification of miracles is an old one, already refuted in the 18th century by such eminent scholars as William Paley and George Campbell, and is rejected as fallacious by most contemporary philosophers as well. Now, I promised to say more about this later, but for now, let me simply say that in the absence of some naturalistic explanation of the facts, Dr. Ehrman's hesitancy about embracing the resurrection of Jesus as the best explanation is really quite unnecessary. Dr. Ehrman would be quite within his rational rights to embrace a miraculous explanation like the resurrection. And so would we. In conclusion, then, I think that there is good historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection. Specifically, I've staked out two basic contentions for discussion tonight. One, there are four historical facts which must be explained by any adequate historical hypothesis: Jesus' burial, the discovery of his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the very origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. And number two, the best explanation of these facts is that Jesus rose from the dead.
Well, I'd like to thank Bill for that highly impressive opening statement. I've heard over the years that Bill is a skilled debater and rhetorician, and now I've seen for myself why the evangelical Christians that he speaks for are so proud of his abilities. In my opening speech here, I'll not be dealing directly with the many, many points the bill has already raised. I'll instead lay out my own case, which, by the way, is not exactly the case that he said I was going to make, although there are some points of similarity. I'll lay out my own case, and in my next speech, I'll show why, in my opinion, the position that he has just staked out is so problematic. I want to say at the outset something similar to what he said at the beginning of his speech. I used to believe absolutely everything that Bill just presented. He and I went to the same evangelical Christian college, Wheaton, where these things are taught. Even before that, I went to a yet more conservative school, Moody Bible Institute, where Bible is our middle name. We were taught these things there even more avidly. I used to believe them with my whole heart and soul. I used to preach them and try to convince others that they were true. But then I began studying these matters, not simply accepting what my teachers had said, but looking at them deeply myself. I learned Greek and started studying the New Testament in the original Greek language. I learned Hebrew to read the Old Testament. I learned Latin, Syriac, and Coptic to be able to study the New Testament manuscripts and the non-canonical traditions of Jesus in their original languages. I immersed myself in the world of first century, reading non-Christian Jewish and pagan texts from the Roman Empire and before. And I tried to master everything written by a Christian from the first 300 years of the church. I became a historian of antiquity, and for 25 years now, I have done my research in this area night and day. I'm not a philosopher like Bill. I'm a historian, dedicated to finding the historical truth. After years of study, I finally came to the conclusion that everything I had previously thought about the historical evidence of the resurrection was absolutely wrong. Let me begin by explaining in simple terms what it is that historians do. Historians try to establish, to the best of their ability, what probably happened in the past. We can't really know the past because the past is done with. We think we know the past in some instances because we have such good evidence for what happened in the past. But in other cases we don't know, and in some cases we just have to throw up our hands in despair. It is relatively certain that Bill Clinton won the election in 1996. It may be somewhat less clear who won the election next time. It's pretty clear that Shakespeare wrote his plays, but there's considerable debate. Why? It was hundreds of years ago, and scholars come up with alternative opinions. It's probable that Caesar crossed the Rubicon, but we don't have a lot of eyewitness testimony. Historians try to establish levels of probability of what happened in the past. Some things are absolutely certain, some are probable, some are possible, some are maybe, some are probably not. What kinds of evidence do scholars look for when trying to establish probabilities in the past? Well, the best kind of evidence, of course, consists of contemporary accounts, people who were close to the time of the events themselves. Ultimately, if you don't have a source that goes back to the time period itself, then you don't have a reliable source. There's only two sources of information for past events. Either stories that actually happened, based on ultimately eyewitness accounts, or stories that have been made up. Those are the only two kinds of stories you have from the past, either things that happened or things that were made up. To determine which things are the things that happened, you want contemporary accounts, things that are close to the time of the events themselves, and it helps if you have a lot of these accounts. The more the merrier. You want lots of contemporary accounts, and you want these accounts to be independent of one another. You don't want different accounts to have collaborated with one another. You want accounts that are independently attesting the results. Moreover, even though you want accounts that are independent of one another, that have not collaborated, you want accounts that corroborate one another. Accounts that are consistent in what they have to say about the subject. Moreover, finally, you want sources that are not biased toward the subject matter. You want accounts that are disinterested. You want lots of them. You want them independent of one another, yet you want them to be consistent with one another. What do we have with the Gospels of the New Testament? Well, unfortunately, we're not as well off as we would like to be. We'd like to be extremely well off because the Gospels tell us about Jesus and they are our best sources for Jesus. But how good are they as historical sources? I'm not questioning whether they're valuable as theological sources, or sources for religious information, but how good are they as historical sources? Unfortunately, they're not as good as we would like. The Gospels were written 35 to 65 years after Jesus' death. 35 or 65 years after his death, not by people who were eyewitnesses, but by people living later. The Gospels are written by highly literate, trained, Greek-speaking Christians of the second and third generation. They're not written by Jesus' Aramaic-speaking followers. They're written by people living 30, 40, 50, 60 years later. Where did these people get their information from? I should point out, in our Gospels, the Gospels say they're written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but that's just in your English Bible. That's the title of these Gospels. But whoever wrote the Gospel of Matthew didn't call it the Gospel of Matthew. Whoever wrote the Gospel of Matthew simply wrote his Gospel, and somebody later said it's the Gospel according to Matthew. Somebody later is telling you who wrote it. The titles are later additions. These are not eyewitness accounts, so where did they get their stories from? After the days of Jesus, people started telling stories about him in order to convert others to the faith. They were trying to convert both Jews and Gentiles. How do you convert somebody to stop worshiping their gods to start worshiping Jesus? You have to tell stories about Jesus. So you convert somebody on the basis of the stories you tell. That person converts somebody who converts somebody who converts somebody, and all along the line, people are telling stories. The way it works is this. I'm a businessman in Ephesus, and somebody comes to town and tells me stories about Jesus, and on the basis of these stories I hear, I convert. I tell my wife these stories. She converts. She tells the next door neighbor the stories. She converts. She tells her husband the stories. He converts. He goes on a business trip to Rome, and he tells people there the stories. They convert. Those people who've heard the stories in Rome, where did they hear them from? They heard them from the guy who lived next door to me. Well, was he there to see these things happen? No. Where did he hear them from? He heard them from his wife. Where did his wife hear them from? Was she there? No. She heard them from my wife. Where did my wife hear them from? She heard them from me. Well, where did I hear them from? I wasn't there either. Stories are in circulation year after year after year, and as a result of that, the stories get changed. How do we know that the stories got changed in the process of transmission? We know the stories got changed because there are numerous differences in our accounts that cannot be reconciled with one another. You don't need to take my word for this. Simply look yourself. I tell my students that the reason we don't notice there's so many differences in the Gospels is because we read the Gospels horizontally. We read them vertically, from top to bottom. You start at the top of Mark, you read through it to the bottom. You start at the top of Matthew, read it to the bottom, sounds a lot like Mark. Then you read Luke, top to bottom, sounds a lot like Matthew and Mark. Read John, a little bit different, sounds about the same. The reason is because we're reading them vertically. The way to see differences in the Gospels is to read them horizontally. Read one story in Matthew, then the same story in Mark, and compare your two stories and see what you come up with. You come up with major differences. Just take the death of Jesus. What day did Jesus die on? And what time of day? Did he die on the day before the Passover meal was eaten, as John explicitly says? Or did he die after it was eaten, as Mark explicitly says? Did he die at noon, as in John, or at 9 a.m., as in Mark? Did Jesus carry his cross the entire way himself, or did Simon of Cyrene carry his cross? It depends which gospel you read. Did both robbers mock Jesus on the cross, or did only one of them mock him, and the other come to his defense? It depends which gospel you read. Did the curtain in the temple rip in half before Jesus died, or after he died? It depends which gospel you read. Or take the accounts of the resurrection. Who went to the tomb on the third day? Was it Mary alone, or was it Mary with other women? If it was Mary with other women, how many other women were there? Which ones were they, and what were their names? Was the stone rolled away before they got there or not? What did they see in the tomb? Did they see a man? Did they see two men? Or did they see an angel? It depends which account you read. What were they told to tell the disciples? Were the disciples supposed to go to Jerusalem and see Jesus there? Were they supposed to stay in Jerusalem and see Jesus there? Or were they to go to Galilee and see Jesus there? Did the women tell anyone or not? It depends which gospel you read. Did the disciples never leave Jerusalem? Or did they immediately leave Jerusalem and go to Galilee? All of these depend on which account you read. You have the same problems for all of the sources in all of our Gospels. These are not historically reliable accounts. The authors were not eyewitnesses. They're Greek-speaking Christians living 35 to 65 years after the events they narrate. The accounts that they narrate are based on oral traditions that have been in circulation for decades. Year after year, Christians trying to convert others told them stories to convince them that Jesus was raised from the dead. These writers are telling stories then that Christians have been telling all these years. Many stories were invented and most of the stories were changed. For that reason, these accounts are not as useful as we would like them to be for historical purposes. They're not contemporary, they're not disinterested, and they're not consistent. But even if these stories were the best sources in the world, there would still be a major obstacle that we simply cannot overcome if we want to approach the question of the resurrection historically rather than theologically. I'm fine if Bill wants to argue that theologically God raised Jesus from the dead, or even if he wants to argue theologically that Jesus was raised from the dead. But this cannot be a historical claim, and not for the reason that he imputed to me as being an old, warmed-over 18th century view that has been refuted ever since. Historians can only establish what probably happened in the past. The problem with historians is they can't repeat the experiment. Today, if we want proof for something, it's very simple to give proof for many things. In the natural sciences, the experimental sciences, we have proof. If I wanted to prove to you that bars of ivory soap float, but bars of iron sink, all I need to do is get 50 tubs of lukewarm water and start chucking in the bars. The ivory soap will always float, the iron will always sink, and after a while we'll have a level of what you might call predictive probability. That if I do it again, the iron's going to sink again and the soap's going to float again. We can repeat the experiments doing experimental science, but we can't repeat the experiments doing history because once history happens, it's over. What are miracles? Miracles are not impossible. I won't say they're impossible. You might think they are impossible. If you do think so, then you're going to agree with my argument even more than I'm going to agree with my argument. I'm just going to say that miracles are so highly improbable that they're the least possible occurrence in any given instance. They violate the way nature naturally works. They are so highly improbable, their probability is infinitesimally remote, that we call them miracles. No one on the face of this earth can walk on lukewarm water. What are the chances that one of us can do it? Well, none of us can. So let's say the chances are 1 in 10 billion. Well, suppose somebody can. Well, then it's a chance in 1 in 10 billion. But in fact, none of us can. What about the resurrection of Jesus? I'm not saying it didn't happen, but if it did happen, it would be a miracle. The resurrection claims are claims that not only did Jesus' body come back to life, it came back to life never to die again. That's a violation of what naturally happens. Every day, time after time, millions of times a year. What are the chances of it happening? Well, it'd be a miracle. In other words, it'd be so highly improbable that we can't account for it by natural means. A theologian may claim that it's true. And to argue with the theologian, we'd have to argue on theological grounds. Because there are no historical grounds to argue on. Historians can only establish what probably happened in the past, and by definition, the miracle is the least probable occurrence. And so, by the very nature of the canons of historical research, we can't claim, historically, that a miracle probably happened. By definition, it probably didn't. And history can only establish what probably did. I wish we could establish miracles, but we can't. It's no one's fault. It's simply that the canons of historical research do not allow for the possibility of establishing the as probable, the least probable of all occurrences. For that reason, Bill's 4 pieces of evidence are completely irrelevant. There cannot be historical probability for an event that defies probability, even if the event did happen. The resurrection has to be taken on faith, not on the basis of proof. Let me illustrate by giving you an alternative scenario of what happened to explain the empty tomb. I don't believe this. I don't think it happened this way. But it's more probable than a miracle happened. Because a miracle, by definition, is the least probable occurrence. So let me give you a theory, just one I dreamt up. I could dream up 20 of these that are implausible, but are still more plausible than a resurrection. Jesus gets buried by Joseph of Arimathea. 2 of Jesus' family members are upset that an unknown Jewish leader has buried the body. In the dead of night, these 2 family members raid the tomb, taking the body off to bury it for themselves. But Roman soldiers on the lookout see them carrying the shrouded corpse through the streets. They confront them and they kill them on the spot. They throw all 3 bodies into a common burial plot where within 3 days these bodies are decomposed beyond recognition. The tomb then is empty. People go to the tomb, they find it empty. They come to think that Jesus was raised from the dead. And they start thinking they've seen him because they know he's been raised because his tomb is empty. This is a highly unlikely scenario. But you can't object that it's impossible to have happened because it's not. People did raid tombs. Soldiers did kill civilians on the least pretext. People were buried in common graves left to rot. It's not likely, but it's more likely than a miracle, which is so unlikely that you have to appeal to supernatural intervention to make it work. This alternative explanation I've given you, which again is not one that I believe, is at least plausible. And it's historical as opposed to Bill's explanation, which is not a historical explanation. Bill's explanation is a theological explanation. The evidence that Bill himself doesn't see his explanation as historical is that he claims that his conclusion is that Jesus was raised from the dead. Well, that's a passive. Was raised. Who raised him? Well, presumably God. This is a theological claim about something that happened to Jesus. It's about something that God did to Jesus. But historians cannot presuppose belief or disbelief in God when making their conclusions. Discussions about what God has done are theological in nature. They're not historical. Historians, I'm sorry to say, have no access to God. The canons of historical research are by their very nature restricted to what happens here, on this earthly plane. They do not and cannot presuppose any set beliefs about the natural realm. I'm not saying this is good or bad. It's simply the way historical research works. Let me give you an analogy. It's not bad that there can be no mathematical proof for the existence of an anti-Semitic polemic in the Merchant of Venice. Mathematics is simply irrelevant to purely literary questions. So too, historical research cannot lead to theological claims about what God has done. To sum up, the sources we have are not as good as we would like. They're written many decades after the fact by people who were not there to see these things happen, who have inherited stories that have been changed in the process of transmission. These accounts that we have of Jesus' resurrection are not internally consistent. They're full of discrepancies, including the accounts of his death and his resurrection. But there's a problem of miracle. It's not the philosophical problem of miracle discussed in the 17th and 18th centuries. It's a historian's problem of miracle. Historians cannot establish miracle as the most probable occurrence because miracles, by their very nature, are the least probable occurrence. Thank you.